Well, kia ora anō e te whānau. Let's get underway with our final sessions for the afternoon. But first, a quick word from Becca.
When you think forward to a world that's easier, more livable and enjoyable, the decisions made today by creative and innovative thinkers will be what has shaped our lives for the better. When it comes to the infrastructure that shapes Aotearoa, we want to create safe and prosperous communities for everyone who calls our country home. Over the past 100 years, we've seen New Zealand grow and change. The people who live here, the way that we work, our connections to the world around us. We've worked shoulder to shoulder with our partners in industry through challenging times. Now, we're about to embark on the largest infrastructure investment in recent history. In a complex and ever-changing world, with challenges like climate change, urbanisation, inequality and digitisation, we have a choice. We choose to make every day better. If we want a sustainable and resilient future, we need to work together to build back better. New Zealand communities need innovative solutions. We need connectivity and integration. We need thoughtful planning that puts people at the heart of what we do. And we need to embrace digital transformation to help us make the most of the opportunities that are ahead. Collaboratively, as infrastructure leaders, we need to challenge ourselves to look for new ways of doing things, to redefine expectations, to disrupt old ways of working, and introduce smart new thinking. From the challenges of large and iconic projects to the less visible yet vital infrastructure that supports how we all live day to day. Our world will continue to change, and together, the future is exciting. We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to transform our world into a stronger, happier, and more sustainable place. We're thinking about the next 100 years and the challenge ahead of us. What will you do to help build back better?
Round of applause, please, for Becca. So we're going to look now at how New Zealand is performing on the global stage. Now, of course, we don't have a lot of nearby big neighbours, so we don't often compare ourselves to best practice overseas. But there is plenty to learn from other countries, of course, particularly those in the OECD. This next presentation that we have is pre-recorded because we have time differences with France. So in this presentation, David Carey, the Senior Economist for the New Zealand desk at the OECD, will give an overview of where New Zealand companies are on the global stage and what the big changes are that we need to face going forward. A round of applause, please, for David Carey.
Thank you for this opportunity to speak at the Rebuilding Nations conference. We've all been through a difficult period in the past months with the COVID crisis, suffered the deepest recession on record. Now we're looking to rebuilding in OECD countries, rebuilding to have stronger growth and bring back government deficits to more sustainable levels. And I thought that in terms of things that New Zealand should focus on in this rebuilding phase, we should focus on overcoming New Zealand's productivity problem and housing affordability, which is weak. So without further ado, I'll turn to the first of those topics, which is about increasing productivity. A long-standing issue for New Zealand is low productivity performance. So when we're thinking about policies to recover, we need to think about increasing productivity. So if we look, first of all, where does New Zealand stand in terms of its level of income per capita? And you can see there, it's the zero there corresponds to the median country in the upper half of OECD countries by income per capita. So New Zealand's about, just over 20% below the median of the upper half of OECD countries. This is all explained, more than explained, by weak labour productivity, which is almost 40% below the median for the upper half of OECD countries. And so the counterpart to why New Zealand's GDP per capita is not lower is because New Zealand does very well in terms of having people having high employment rate, of putting labour to work. And that's things like, in particular, a big influence there is that New Zealanders don't retire effectively as they retire a lot later than a lot of people do in other countries. Now, if we look at labour productivity growth in New Zealand in the since the mid-90s, it's been well below the OECD average, and that's actually that's a bit disappointing, really, given that New Zealand has had massively reformed its economy before this period, 1995, and at the beginning of this period, and normally a country that starts off with a relatively low level of labour productivity normally that's a factor that contributes to rapid productivity growth afterwards, because there's a possibility to catch up by imitating the productivity leaders. In the case of in any case, in New Zealand, the labour productivity growth has been less than 1% over this period. Here we can see the level of gross fixed non-residential capital formation, so fixed investment that's not in housing, and it's related to the labour force. And we see that New Zealand has been really quite low for a long period here. So one of the things that, even though investment mightn't be so low, the fact is New Zealand has very high growth in the labour force. So you need a high amount of investment in order to keep the capital labour ratio growing. So that's a factor that's contributing to this low level of investment per person in the labour force. Why is investment low? Well, factors that contribute to that are the high cost of capital in New Zealand. So we are a nation that invests more than it saves. That's reflected in current account deficits. Since we're reliant on foreign capital to finance investment, at the margin, we end up having relatively high interest rates it's more risky for foreigners to invest in New Zealand. They have exchange rate risk, amongst other things, than investing in their home markets. New Zealand has thin venture capital, stock and bond markets. So that's... Now, turning to infrastructure, we see the perceived quality of the overall infrastructure in New Zealand is relatively low by international comparison, as is the net amount of the investment in road infrastructure. So we have recommended in the past that one of the things to have a bit of performance in this regard would be to implement infrastructure demand management strategies, so to use the infrastructure more efficiently. So, for example, to introduce congestion charging, and so that would to manage the demand for roading. And then we come to this again, but to diversify revenue sources for infrastructure financing, so that it's possible to finance more infrastructure where that's valuable investment. Now, another issue that we've touched on as well in recent surveys is that New Zealand has relatively high skills mismatches. Now, what are we talking about here with skills? These are the skills as measured by the PIAC studies, which are information processing skills. When people are mismatched for the job they do, the skills that are normally required for the job that they do, that means they're overskilled or they're underskilled for that job. And so that has a negative effect on productivity. And so here we have a study that we quoted that was done at the OECD, found that New Zealand had a relatively large potential gains from reducing skills mismatch. So how do you do that? Well, actually, when the study looked at the different factors, the most important one in New Zealand was housing supply restrictions, to ease housing supply restrictions. The problem is when you have the situation New Zealand has had is that housing supply is not very responsive to demand, and that makes the cost of housing in places that have a lot of more highly productive jobs, like in Auckland or Wellington, it makes it difficult for people to move there. And so that's why you end up getting this negative productivity effect. So now there are other reasons why New Zealand, well known that New Zealand is not very well integrated in global value chains. So the international, this is under the heading of international connectedness. New Zealand is not very strong on this, and it's largely to do with its location. It's far from major markets. So then we see here, this is a figure that shows the exports relative to GDP for smaller countries, which were defined as having a population of less than 30 million. And again, we see New Zealand has very low export intensity for a small country. So this weak international connectedness, it reduces New Zealand's ability to benefit from global frontier innovation. And so one thing that New Zealand could do is it should aim to increase foreign direct investment, and for that there needs to be a narrowing of the screening in the Overseas Investment Commission and reduced compliance costs and greater predictability for investors. As you probably all remember, the political decisions to intervene in some big investments in the past were like Auckland Airport, had a very bad effect on foreign investor confidence. We also had a look at doing a comparison of the productivity gap with Australia. What we saw there was by sector, the greatest contribution to the productivity gap to Australia was with Australia were the two sectors. Construction was the biggest productivity gap, and financial services was the second biggest. Many studies have found that effectively the construction industry lags in productivity with respect to Australia. And so in relation to that, we suggested that the Commerce Commission should, now that it has the power to conduct market studies, should conduct one on the construction industry. There is a problem with this contributes as well to the construction industry productivity, and it contributes to the high cost of housing in New Zealand. So turning to housing, New Zealand has had a phenomenal increase in house prices relative to disposable incomes. You can see that we've highlighted Australia and Canada here as well as the OECD. You see for the OECD, house prices relative to incomes have not rocketed at all like in New Zealand. They have gone up, but of course what Australia, Canada and New Zealand have in common is very high levels of immigration. That's potentially positive for productivity. It permits agglomeration effects. It provides the skills because it's focused on selecting skilled immigrants. But what you need if you have high levels of population growth like that is to have a responsive housing supply so that you don't get it, because the immigrants tend to go to the cities where the high skilled jobs are proposed. So you really need to complement those policies with increased housing supply responsiveness to demand. We see here expenditure on housing and maintenance is extremely high in New Zealand, the highest in the OECD. The effects on the people in the lowest income quintile are quite dramatic. So we have there, more than 50% are spending more than 40% of their income on rent, which is the highest amongst OECD countries with data. So the low-income people in New Zealand are really hard hit by this high cost of housing. And, by the way, as we've seen, and it's well known in New Zealand, because the price of land is so high, it hasn't been attractive for developers to develop low-cost housing. It's to make it economic when you have to pay so much for the land, they put in high-cost housing. So here we see this is just another demonstration of the way that housing supply has failed to expand to meet demand. We see here the problem in New Zealand has been in Auckland, where the number of people per dwelling has gone up substantially, is a lot higher than we see in Australia or the rest of New Zealand. So well on people who are living rough or in an emergency or homeless accommodation, or relative to the other countries with data, that's quite high. And New Zealand has a small social housing stock by international comparison as well. So just to wrap up, we had the recent national policy statement on urban development is a very positive move. for easing urban containment policies and making housing supply more elastic, as they say, in relation to demand. The issue is still, though, one of the things, so there's been regulation, containment policies that have held back housing supply in areas with high demand. But the other issue has been how you finance the infrastructure that's needed to service increased housing supply. In this regard, we've recommended increasing user charging for water and roads and removing barriers to greater use of targeted rates in order to try and claw back some of the property value increases from changes in land use regulation or from infrastructure investment. And another interesting development could be to use targeted rates to pay for project-specific infrastructure loans. So that could be ways of easing the financing constraints that local bodies face in order to increase the housing supply and make them less adverse to growth. So, I mean, another issue here is also, whether local housing more generally, local bodies should share more generally in some tax base that's linked to growth. I mean, so we still have to move forward on breaking giving them incentives to have growth instead of the current situation where they have incentives that are opposed to growth, financial incentives. Another development recently has been the establishment of the National Housing and Urban Development Authority, which actually, again, should be a positive development for assisting with land amalgamation in specific areas, which should make it possible to do projects for sort of more intense housing development that are actually more sensible rather than when you can just buy individual sections and with houses in between. I mean, you can't do a big townhouse development, for example. So that's a positive development. And then we argued for a refocusing of Kiwi Build in the last survey to be away from selling houses to first-time buyers towards supplying land through aggregating fragmented land holdings and de-risking development sites. So that comes to the last point, which is that New Zealand does need to increase social housing provision in areas with shortages. So we had, including through expanding partnerships with non-governmental organisations and reallocating funding from Kiwi Build. So I think in the recovery from this COVID, about measures that will contribute to increasing New Zealand's productivity and making housing more affordable, I think that would be very good for New Zealanders' future well-being. Thank you.
So it's David Carey there, telling us, of course, that, well, we know we're lagging behind OECD countries. Our labour productivity is low. We also know our infrastructure provision and quality are low, but it was quite something to see it in black and white, wasn't it? How to solve it, David says, reduce skills mismatches, and some of the solution lies in fixing the housing shortage, and that is where we see the highs, the phenomenal increase in housing prices relative to incomes, and we are, of course, not meeting our population growth with housing supply. Our rent prices are high as well, so low-income earners are doubly hit by high housing costs, so perhaps look at increasing the rental stock. As I said, quite the thing to see all this data in black and white, plenty of challenges there. So after 2 days of promises, presentations and networking, we've learned a lot about what New Zealand's infrastructure looks like currently, but what do we want it to look like in the future? How do we make the shift from today's reality to tomorrow's hopes and plans? This next panel with some of the key leaders and change makers in our country will discuss how we as a country can actually make progress on the big challenges we collectively face. So we're going to welcome to the stage Susan Freeman-Greene, Fraser Whineray, Dame Paula Rebstock and Sir Stephen Tindall with their moderator, Fran O'Sullivan.
ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the final panel of this wonderful 2 days of debate and discussion. Can I just remind you, you will have the opportunities to pose questions to the panel, so please do that. It'll be your last chance for full-on involvement in the event. Can I just take you back to the Prime Minister when she opened the symposium yesterday? She underlined the COVID recovery would not be business as usual. She said, "I don't need to tell you that any recovery plan for New Zealand cannot and should not be a return to the status quo. It's about taking a crisis and turning it into a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to build back better, to address decades of needs, and to do it in partnership with local infrastructure providers." So it's been, to me, an interesting couple of days. This debate has been raging over some issues, in fact, that we've covered quite a lot in the past, around the infrastructure deficit, where pipelines are or not. And you've expressed some concern about delivery, and that's come through not only from the point of view of the infrastructure pipeline itself, but also the ability of construction firms and others to get that source of continuous work, which enables them to offer job security to people. Alongside that, perhaps the negatives of the past couple of days, has been some really interesting debate and I guess just really pointing a light to the kind of things we can be addressing. Decarbonisation, for instance, which was absolutely fascinating, and we are starting to think about and grapple with these issues. Also, some decisions we'd taken in the past, like the ultra-fast broadband, which actually enabled us to survive well as a nation when COVID happened and people had to transfer their workplaces back home. So lots of ideas, lots of new thoughts, lots of conversation, but this panel here is to talk about transferring all those big ideas into action. And so it's my pleasure to introduce our four panellists, Fraser, Whineray, Dame Paula, Rebstock, Sir Stephen Tindall, sorry about that, and Susan Freeman-Greene. So if I could start with you, Fraser, you have been former chair of the Prime Minister's Business Advisory Council, and I think it's fair to say that your group last year rather shocked politicians and also business people by saying we were in an infrastructure crisis. Tell me more about that and where you think we are now. So the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Fran. Yeah, we did in June 19, and that letter's still online if you look at pmbac.org.nz or .co.nz. We said it was in crisis, but I think now it's moved from a crisis of, because the Business Advisory Council could see what infrastructure enables in society, it's now turning, I think, into an opportunity crisis where if we go forward 10 years and we haven't seized the day, and other countries do, then we'll probably lose the most important form of capital, which is our human capital, to other countries which are more desirable places potentially to live in the long term. So what that letter was also talking about was how infrastructure is actually well-being, and we'd probably more use the word citizen-centric, but we wanted to use well-being that letter to make sure that what infrastructure enables is clear. And infrastructure kind of reminds me of the Monty Python, Life of Brian thing, where they said, what have the Romans ever done for us? And then they went through that long list in their debate, and of course it added up to pretty much most of the infrastructure which enables society to work. And of course that everything's good until it's not. And so celebrating infrastructure a bit more and having a national sort of more plan for it was part of what was in that letter. The second thing just I'd mention on one of the pieces of advice we gave, which was on KiwiSaver, and in large part to try and remove inequities in KiwiSaver. But I think in terms of alternative funding models, which come with alternative diverse ideas, innovation for executing and owning infrastructure, as opposed to sort of this reticence to let the public sector let go of the ownership and execution of it. I think if KiwiSaver was strengthened, then there'd be more money so that Kiwis could actually participate in the value over 10, 20, 30 years as they're thinking about retirement products, as opposed to it simply being a New Zealand kind of almost mentality is I don't want anyone but the public sector to own it because I couldn't bear the thought of someone making $1 out of it. The simple solve for that is let Kiwis make $1 out of it for their retirement, because that's kind of the natural product to line up against infrastructure. So that was the second piece of advice, Fran.
Yeah, thank you. Dame Paula, you're an independent director with a interesting suite of companies, Vector, ACC, others, but I think we've heard a lot over the last couple of days about what government could be doing. Obviously, 5 ministers speaking, including the Prime Minister and the new Infrastructure Minister. There's been a lot of focus on that, but what about the private sector itself? What could it be doing?
Thanks, Fran. I mean, I certainly agree with Fraser that the government has to set the vision and narrow our focus on the things that can really make a difference. But we do know from overseas countries that there usually are a fairly sizable group of companies in a country who have a disruptive mindset and culture, who look into the future and see the opportunity that the markets of the future will present, and they go for it. They have a strong customer orientation, they have the scale required, they build the internal capability, and they access the capital, international expertise, and technology solutions that are needed. And in doing so, they build in an approach to sustainability and create platforms for further options in the future. We, in the business community in New Zealand, don't have to wait for government to show us the way. We need to recognize those industries that are ripe for disruption. We recognized that at ACC 5 years ago, that the insurance business was ripe for disruption. We didn't have to do it. We are a statutory monopoly. We chose to do it and invested $650 million in transforming that agency. Vector itself has really embraced the key components of building for the future. It is very customer focused. It has looked into the future and asked what kind of energy networks do we need to service the community in the future. And one of the critical things it has done is recognize that it didn't have all the skills and capability it needed. It did have the scale, did have access to funds, but didn't have all the capability. And it has partnered with the leading technology companies around the world to position Vector for the future. Now, Vector is one distribution company of many. It also recognizes that many of the others will never have the scale and access to capability it does. And it has the potential to provide that so that others can leverage off of it. We are partnering with the best. We signed recently an agreement with AWS Services. We are one of few strategic alliances they've entered into in the world, only 7. And we are the only one in the energy sector. It will transform the way we use smart meters. We have a similar agreement with another technology company to re-envision what we can do in terms of the running of the network, its maintenance, and how we invest. This has really changed the worldview for Vector. We need more companies in New Zealand to recognize this and stop waiting for government and others to tell it what, when, and how to do things.
So, Stephen, I think it's fair to say you've never waited around to be told what to do. You're an ideas man. You've been transforming ideas into actions for a long time, and also champion New Zealand's international prowess. But looking at New Zealand, how do you see New Zealand right now and some of those big issues we should be tackling in the infrastructure space?
Right now, I think we're a country without a strategy. And I think we need a 21st century strategy. And I think a great segue from what Fran's just said, I think I want to talk about 3 new infrastructures that we really need to focus on in a strategy way. And I'll start with data, and then we'll go on to the other 2 later. But we think that data really is the thing that will drive New Zealand forward and actually take care of the things that the 2 previous speakers have talked about. So, 90% of the world's data has actually happened in only the last 2 years. The shift of investment from roads into digital, I think, really needs to be our focus. AI, blockchain, and 5G are the things that are going to transform that. And I can tell you through my involvement with both Team New Zealand and with with Rocket Lab, that it's the technology that actually makes you win. China, Germany, South Korea, Norway, Poland, Taiwan have made data their key focus. We should not be left behind. More equitable outcomes for education and health will be the result, particularly in health. I've got several investments in health, and what's going to happen is you're not going to have to go and visit patients. In fact, driving here today, I heard on the radio that someone's invented a cap you can put on children, and you can actually measure their brain from another place. So amazing stuff. And then smart meters, as we've just heard, are going to be the way too for both energy, for water, and for cyber security.
Okay, so just moving that along and thinking about how do we actually do this change?
Well, thank you. Kia ora koutou. I'm Susan Freeman-Greene, and just the very new Chief Executive of Local Government New Zealand, which is actually pretty central to the delivery and implementation of building better, if you like. So I'm very new in this role and thinking quite hard about how to leverage the huge value that local government plays to communities and holds in communities, because it's closer to communities than any other sector, and all initiatives that we think about in this room will play into that at some stage in some way in terms of our well-beings, which is what it's all about. I think the point around harnessing innovation and technology is absolutely right, and going for it, and I think that's important. But as well as thinking about the things that we have to do, there are an awful lot of ideas generated in this room and over the last couple of days. I think it's really important to think about how we do it, and I'll expand on these with a couple of examples later, but for me, what is it that is about taking the kernel of an idea and turning it into meaningful action that makes a real difference in a sustainable way? And 4 things that I think are really valid and important are that innovation and ideas mean change, and leading change is both a process of getting things done and taking people with you. So it's much about how you approach it as what you do and what the idea is. Secondly, you have to know why you're doing what you're doing and what you're trying to achieve. So an aspirational vision and a direction and a clear strategy and a focus on the difference you want to make and the outcomes you want to see helps us a lot when things get stuck and we hit the inevitable hurdles. You need to know your why, and it's a bit of a hearts and minds game. And thirdly, no idea will be turned into action by yourself. We know this so much. We pay a lot of lip service to partnerships and collaboration and allies and inclusion and diversity. But how many of us are really prepared to hold the discomfort that happens when you're in a room with people who think differently from yourself and invest thinking hard about how we do that without it slowing us down? And fourthly, we need to be brave. We have to challenge that status quo, because when we do that and we bring ourselves together, we can achieve all sorts of magic. We saw that in COVID. If there's any COVID response, if there's ever any evidence we need about how collectively we can galvanize around a common goal and and do things differently and adapt to new ways, it was through the last few months. We kind of need to bottle that.
I mean, one of the big challenges out of the last couple of days, and indeed, right across the business community now, is thinking about decarbonisation, sustainable finance, a whole raft of issues which are challenging us and also challenging the way we move to new infrastructures. And I wondered if you could all, you've each been involved in thinking about this, whether you could just give us a bit of insight into that. From your own experience. And I'm thinking here wearing your Mercury hat, obviously, but not just there.
Particularly decarbonising.
Yes, and moving toward new infrastructure, EVs, and so on.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to kick that off. I know there's lots of people who are heavily involved in decarbonisation and energy and transport.
Yeah.
Look, the core thing with decarbonisation, and this kind of speaks to a broader point I'll touch on is finding out what are the big rocks that are actually going to move it, as opposed to things that an overseas country have done which may be unique to their circumstances. And typically that's because overseas grids are run on coal, and that isn't the case in New Zealand. So we talk about 100% renewable electricity, but actually that'll happen when Tiwai shuts. So it's kind of, the real challenge is on energy, not electricity here. So rather than think of it as a defence of how do we solve this carbon budget for New Zealand, it's kind of more, I think about it more as what are the things we can do to push the advantage home, where we have trillions of dollars in multi-decade advantage over competing nation states if decarbonisation is going to be really important for supply chains of our offshore customers with whom we trade. And of course, electrification of transport, absolute no-brainer for New Zealand given the grid it's got. And if you're not aware of the meme, it's 30 cents a litre. If you want to drive for 30 cents a litre, electrify your transport. If you want to ride a electric bike, it would be even cheaper. But I'll hand off to Paula.
Thanks for that. I guess there's a lot of interest in energy on this panel, and certainly Vector is a natural partner for advancing work on decarbonisation. And much of the technology investments that we're making with our partners offshore will support the sort of changes that Fraser has spoken to. We certainly did some work with Impress to allow us to allow solar and EV chargers and other forms of energy enter into our network in a rather impressive way. And it's exactly those things that have to happen behind the scenes for this to come together. I did want to just touch on one other thing, Fran, if I could, and wearing a different hat, and that is of an investment fund. Some time ago, the ACC's fund came under some pressure to say what it would do to decarbonize the fund. And this was a big challenge for us. I mean, we do a lot to ensure that levy payers in this country pay less for their accident insurance and cover. But getting into the space of what our contribution would be to decarbonizing the economy was really a challenge. And the biggest challenge for us was just to get over the hurdle that said we had to do something. And once we did that, and we set about saying, well, how will we decarbonize? And what will be the cost of doing it? The board was very interested to know what would be the cost to returns if we decarbonize the fund, not just in line with the government's legislation, but preferably in advance to give us as much optionality as possible. And I think it was a really important lesson for me, because once we stopped having the discussion about how expensive it was going to be, started talking about how to do it, we actually, when it came time to estimate what the cost would be once we'd worked out what we would need to do, we found out actually we couldn't even measure the cost to returns of taking the steps to decarbonize. The fund has already done enough to reduce the carbon impact by 20%. We expect to get to 50% within the next decade. It'll get much harder after that, but we did learn that getting started on it early and stopping just discussing how hard it is and how much it's going to cost and getting into it, you might actually be surprised that it's still hard, but the costs may not be what you think they might be.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and I know we've been through that conversation at the warehouse group for a long, long time, and once you start the journey, it becomes a lot easier. In terms of renewable, Fran, as Fraser says, it's a no-brainer to get into EVs. It's a matter now of some sort of legislation that pushes that through. We know, in the previous government that was stopped. But I'm encouraged by some of the discussions with ministers now that this will be a really major objective for them. We're involved in solar, but also now newly in hydrogen. So we're going to have trucks on the road next year hauling freight. We're putting up 4 windmills in Kapuni that will make hydrogen, which will then go, some of the offtake will go to fertiliser, so green fertiliser rather than importing brown fertiliser. But, you know, really trying to go fast into hydrogen for heavy vehicles, I think, is very important. Fraser mentioned Tiwai, let's see what happens there, but if we can redirect that energy into to get coal right out of the system. We've got coal in schools and hospitals and factories. Let's get rid of it real quick.
And from the point of view of the local government sector, how do you accelerate this change?
Well, I mean, it's a massive challenge, but I know that is really top of the mind for our local government and our councils and our sector, and as it was in the engineering sector, which is where I came from. And I think the point is you actually have to get over the hurdle that you made, Dame Paula, you have to get over the hurdle of saying, this is really hard, to the actual how can we do this.
Okay, so just on that point, because we have a question from the floor for you, Susan. Local government has so much buying power, why not simply include carbon emissions reporting requirements in procurement policy to get widespread measurement started?
Well, it's a good idea. Just new into the role, I'd hate to make a pronouncement on that, but I know that that's something that we're thinking seriously about. It's actually how do you actually deal with that. Local government has such an important role to play in how these things play out in our communities, and actually communities are going to have to buy into whatever changes we make. So that's a really important intersection between business, iwi, central government decisions, private sector ideas. At the end of the day, we have to create a framework where communities will get involved and play their part.
I've just got a few questions from the audience, and do keep them coming, and then we'll come back to some final points as we're moving on time. So just a question to the panel. You don't all have to answer unless you've got a beeline on this, and it's how do we actually speed up the business case and government decision-making processes? Talks about how design and build timeframes are not the issue, but the decision to fund and commit is. I mean, you have seen this wearing your prior hat.
We're a private entity and listed entity, so to line up long-dated capital against long-dated projects, you've got to be pretty patient, and before you, as we did in Mercury, push play on New Zealand's largest wind farm now under construction in Palmy, but I think it's the decision to fund public infrastructure, I think, is potentially where that question's coming from, and I was thinking I'd throw it your way to just see what do you think of that process to sort of go this against Stephen's point of what's the master plan, what's our strategy, so we can line up all those ingredients, human, financial, capital, consortia, all at that right moment, so that we're not going, we want to go now, and now what's next?
Well, that's right. You have to start by having everyone in the conversation, and I know that there's a challenge around having everyone in the conversation in terms of whether that actually slows it down, but I just think about the example that Nicole used today, Nicole Rosier from Wakatahi, around the Kaikoura work and restoration, and opening up those rail and road networks in less than a year. And if you think about that huge infrastructure project, it was galvanized by a vision, which was moving mountains to reconnect communities. It involved every part of every sector in that. I think there were something like 2 million hours used. Community, people in the community, iwi, thought about all the outcomes, environmental, and it happened fast and it happened effectively, and they worked in building the plane as they're flying the plane, huge safety issues, huge hurdles. And that is just a massive example of how, when we galvanise behind an idea, we can get things happening.
But that's very similar to what a lot of businesses experienced during COVID. There's the crisis,
exactly.
We've got to hang ourselves together. Everyone went, wow, this is so awesome. Why can't we recreate this when the COVID's gone? So how do we have the crisis mentality without the crisis?
You have the vision, right? You have to have the vision. You have to know where you're going and what your goal is. I mean, in our context, we decided that we were going to bring engineering to life, so we set about doing it, and we turned lots of ideas into action. different ideas by actually having a vision, being clear who we need in the room, thinking about all the different people, and actually making things happen really quickly.
I mean, Stephen, I was thinking back, you were talking about hydrogen, and that does seem to be moving pretty fast. I mean, what sort of lessons do you actually have for this audience about pushing on the cusp of change, creating that constituency so government actually says, let's actually get this done, and speeds up the process?
Most of the lessons I've had have been that we've had to go and do things ourselves. So, for example, affordable housing, we started doing 20 years ago with the New Zealand Housing Foundation. We've still only built about 1,100 houses. It's just so subscale. So, what we need right now is an answer to the crisis. We absolutely have a housing crisis. And we've got to have a national vision and a national strategy to deal with it. And, I know people that have the solutions. It's a matter of bringing New Zealand along with you, but then having the guts to go ahead and do it. And, and the thing is, at the moment, there is no overseas people investing in housing in New Zealand in the asset class because it's just so expensive. It's about double the price it is when you compare it with overseas countries. So you've got to use technology to bring the cost down. You've got to have a cost centre and you've got to have a technology centre. And so I'm involved with some people who've been travelling around the world looking at how you do that, and you do it with robotics. And we've just got to, as a country, we've just got to go down that path. The government need lots and lots and lots more houses. So if they give the orders to the people that can build them cheaper, let's do it. I mean, I think that I also wanted to say that there's been 4 things that have happened. The Urban Development Bill, and real thanks to Hamish Glenn from Infrastructure New Zealand, because he's really turned the needle on that one. There's the Modular Housing Bill, that's a big step forward. And the establishment of Kāinga Ora, that actually has changed the dialogue. We're really impressed with that. And now, of course, the Commerce Commission inquiry into what I think is going to be a productivity inquiry rather than a building materials inquiry. So congratulations to Infrastructure New Zealand for what they've started. But, let's try and solve this housing crisis by having a vision, having a strategy, and doing it together.
And doing it at scale, right?
Scale, every time.
Scale will be critical, and
that brings the cost down.
We have to accept that.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the warehouse didn't get the prices down until we had scale.
Yeah. And getting the scale means some disruption to the industry.
Not necessarily.
We know it today.
I think there's a way, if you're smart about this, you bring the industry with you, because they've got to help you deliver it.
Yeah. Sure, they have to help, but using new forms. Yeah, absolutely.
But you can make the forms for them to deliver.
I just wanted to pick up on the comment around how you get things going and get them funded and into actual production. And we do have some experience in this. The Crown has invested in public-private partnerships, not at a huge scale, but enough that we've learned how to do it. And as long as the Crown can specify well enough what it requires and then go to market, the market will be able to price the cost of it, the risk of it, and the market will form alliances to get the work done. At that point, and go through a competitive process, at that point, the Crown needs to step back and let the market drive the result. And we need to do it at much bigger scale than we've seen in the past. But we do have good experience on it. We see PPPs in roads, we see it in housing, we've seen it in education, we've seen it in health, we've seen it in a wide range of areas, even prisons. We've had a PPP in the prison space. So this is not new territory. This is about being clear what you want done, let the market price it, go through a competitive process, and then let the market drive through a consortium in the private sector drive to a result.
Yeah, a very interesting question from the floor. We can act fast when responding to a crisis such as Kaikoura, but how do we recognise slow-moving crises now and move to action?
We don't need to, do we? We've already got fast-moving crises.
Yeah.
Well, I think it comes down to the points that the other panel members have made around if you've got a bit more of a master plan or vision, and then all the incremental steps which you want individual actors, not central actors. You want lots of other individual actors to bring their diverse thoughts and capital and creativity and ideas and innovation, even if that's overseas. Heaven forbid we could get out of a DIY mentality in New Zealand, then we can, then all of those incremental steps can head towards what that vision is, but define that vision in terms of it's not we've got our road, it's this connects people. It's just making sure I think we get the human definition to the outcome of the infrastructure. And you see this kind of play out in local planning contexts where someone's trying to build a road and that's an inanimate object, and everyone's objections to it are very personal stories. And personal stories carry a lot more weight in the media than there's a road. I think we need to say, well, these are the great well-being benefits of this infrastructure, and have that much more loudly sung in the debate, because that's what the point of infrastructure is. It's citizen-centric enablement of what people want to get on with in their lives.
Sorry, I just couldn't agree more. I think, having spent the last few years working with the engineering profession, was like, can we tell the stories not about the technical stuff that you do, which is amazing and unbelievable and creative problem solving, but talk about the outcomes it provides and the benefit it gives. Engineers don't build bridges, they connect communities. It's just so much more inspiring to the future generations, and
I hope you build them too.
So value proposition, right? Like what is, how do you get people to think about, how do you get people to move to slightly longer term thinking when you don't have the immediate crisis? Is around, well, the bit of reality checking, what's going to happen if, and finding the value in the proposition.
I think a good one is really climate change, and we do know that it might be a slow-moving thing, but we are going to need to move it's something like 200,000 houses out of the flood zones. There's nothing sure it's going to happen, so why aren't we now starting to think about how we do that? Some of these flood zones, like South Dunedin, are going to start flooding much sooner than others, so got to put in the work to start doing that now. And I think the imperative is, the fact is this is going to flood. We know it is, so let's do it.
Yeah, just possibly springboarding on that, and it doesn't have to take a whole panel response, but why is the New Zealand construction sector labour productivity so low, and what's the single most effective policy that could better this? Anyone have a lens on that?
Well, I would once again, I bring that back to digital and to innovation, to robotics, to just doing it smarter. That will make it move a lot faster.
And one of the questions, and again, it's sort of been raised probably more tangentially during this conference, but do we need to set national or even regional population growth targets to feed into immigration policy? And it's not expanded, so I presume that is to look at where, the infrastructure pressures would come on. I mean, is there a view on that around here? Yeah.
Not from me.
Well, I think this is a critical area we need to get right. In the last decade, much of our growth has come from increasing our population size. It hasn't come from productivity improvements and gains. And these things don't have to work against each other, but if we get them out of sync, they will. And part, we won't be able to build infrastructure fast enough to support the growth in the population. That does not create a long-term sustainable path for New Zealand. That's not to say I'm anti-immigration, I'm not. I think it's absolutely critical. It's critical for bringing in some of the human capital that we need, and scale and size does matter. But we can't fool ourselves that growth that comes from population growth alone and labor growth is sufficient. We will not be able to afford the infrastructure that New Zealanders want and expect if that's the nature of growth on its own.
I mean, the great thing, Fran, as you've probably seen from the latest Kia survey is there's hundreds of thousands of Kiwis are saying they want to come home, and this time the people we've surveyed are saying that they're people that have been away for 10, 15 years. They've got plenty of money, they've got the skills, they want to come back and reinvest even in their own businesses. But we haven't got the houses to put them in, so we've got a housing crisis. So, you know.
Can I add one more thing to that too, is I think immigration settings actually are a subset of our overall human capital settings. And so what you need on immigration is because you haven't made it over the long term yourself, bearing in mind that the lead time on getting someone who's currently 5 to when they're productive in the workforce, which is probably 20 years later, that takes a fair bit of forward thinking. And at the moment, and this was a paper that we wrote, a short policy we wrote for in the Prime Minister's Business Advisory Council, is we actually need to aggregate long-term views of 5, 10, 15-year requirements, and that be the driver through the education system, as opposed to the way tertiary institutions in particular and secondary institutions are currently lining up the rangatahi to come into the workforce. So, because if there's a mismatch there, then all the employing organisations, which includes the public sector, not just private, go, I need some people. There's inflexibility in the short end because I've got 20 years to wait for that primary school kid to get through. So you go for immigration, and then you run into Paula's problem of the infrastructure required to support one house, one bit of footpath, one road, 2 cars. Half a school is just too hard. We can't afford it. So, you know.
Yeah, I think we do have to grow and think about how we create the pipeline of talent, and you know, I'm really mindful of that in the STEM space and the science, technology, maths and engineering space, and you know, you have to think about that broadly. In the engineering New Zealand world, we decided that was an issue, and set about creating something that would excite and inspire kids to get into these things called the Wonder Project, which is had to be scalable, had to be accessible, and that was an idea that we turned into action. From a pilot, we've now had 30,000 kids go through a sustained intervention program with industry ambassadors that was over 50% girls, 30% Māori and Pacifica, kids who are getting the first exposure of an experience of saying, actually, you know, we had Rocket Lab engineers involved in the original design, and kids and teachers, and they had the full engagement of the communities that were affected, and scalable. And what we have is, you know, doubling the kids who want to do engineering from that, so impact as well. And I think that, you know, thinking what the problems are, what we need to solve them in the future is going to be critical as well to, you know, an idea, making it happen and moving forward.
I've just got one final question which has come from the floor, which is quite current really, and it's further to your thinking, views of thinking at scale and focusing on reducing carbon emissions from fossil fuels. What are your thoughts on repurposing the electricity that feeds Tiwai for hydrogen production if the smelter were to exit?
My idea on that is a green hydrogen plant, because there's huge demand from Japan, Korea, Singapore for green hydrogen, but we can also use it ourselves for things like decarbonising factories and schools, etc. So that would be my one.
Yeah, there's lots of opportunities in that. I think the key thing is Contact's been promoting for some time is we need an orderly exit, because then everyone can line up their ideas and capital and people and to do that. But at a 12-month option on a notice, you just can't get anything arranged, because we've already been talking about how long it takes to make decisions. And you know, smelter has been leaving since it was built 40 years ago. It's always just a matter of when, and we don't know when. So if we knew when...
It does sound like the decommissioning is a 3 to 5 year process anyway, and most people won't lose their jobs overnight.
So just very quickly, about a sentence each, a final thought for this audience about getting that acceleration and turning those ideas into action.
I think the main thing is that we don't procrastinate too long. Pick a couple of things that are bipartisan supported, major things, and then as long as they're citizen-centric and they're described in the well-being that it creates for those citizens, and let's get on with it.
I think we have to trust our business community to embrace disruption where it needs to happen and provide the means for the government to deliver on some of the long-standing issues that we face in housing and energy and climate. We are in a fortunate situation right now that we do not have as big a constraints around funding in the private sector and within the Crown's investment arms that we once did. And in fact, we don't even have the long-standing interest rate differential that we thought prevented investment in infrastructure for so long. So we need to embrace the capability that the business community can bring and the funding that some of our domestic
I'll have to pass on because the thing's flashing at me, Stephen. Sir Stephen?
So have a strategy.
Yeah.
Go for it. I mean, for example, 5G, the industry will deliver it. The government doesn't have to. In housing, the government's just got to put up the orders for the houses they need. Private investment can actually make it happen.
One final thought?
Be brave. Think about the future. Think about the people that you're doing the work for and challenge the status quo.
Thank you very much to my panel today. It's been stimulating, forward thinking. I hope it's inspired you as it's inspired me. And thank you also for the participation in the questions from the floor. A round of applause, please, for the panel.
Thanks.
That was a fantastic panel. Thank you very much, all of you. Just to go over what we heard in there, Fraser saying, you know, we have an opportunity, we also have a crisis. We don't want to have an opportunity crisis. We need to seize the day or risk losing our human capital. We heard from Dame Paula that we don't need the government to show us what to do. Private players can lead the way for change and make way for other providers, so stop waiting for the government. So Stephen was blunt. We're a country without a strategy. It's as simple as that. We're a country without a strategy. Among the solutions, other world leaders have made data the focus, and we should too. Susan challenged us to not just pay lip service to collaboration and partnership, stand and stay in hard spaces to learn, and let's move away from that. It's going to be hard to do this too. We need to see this as the opportunity to do it. But how do you get everyone into that conversation? How about using Kokoda, Susan said. It was galvanised by a vision, as was, added Fraser, COVID. So we have proven that we can move forward together when we're galvanised in a common cause and by a vision. When that is articulated, the money, the will and the action is found. We have seen that. There was a really great question from the floor. What if it's a slow-moving crisis? It's easy to galvanise around a crisis that's right here, right now. Fraser and Susan said, we'll look to the power of storytelling. Engineers don't build bridges, Susan said, they connect communities. And so Stephen added that we'll need to utilise the power of storytelling to get the message around, for example, climate change. Although, of course, we know the flood isn't coming, it's here right now, so we need to start building and take action, which is, in fact, the message of this entire conference. Let's take action now, let's embrace disruption, let's be brave, let's get on with it now. So a big thanks to our panel. Moderator Fran O'Sullivan with the panellists, Susan Freeman-Greene, Fraser Whineray, Dame Paula Rebstock and Sir Stephen Tindall. Thank you very much. Now that ends the official part of the conference, but I'd like to call the Infrastructure New Zealand Chair, Andrew Stevens, up to present a few awards and some thank yous. Welcome.
Slightly more appropriate music this time. Thank you, Miriama. Now, some very brief conference highlights. It's been an incredible 2 days. Thank you for spending your time with us. I hope you have found the presentations insightful and the networking productive. There's still quite a bit of it going on out there. And that you will go home with a greater appreciation and renewed passion for the infrastructure sector, a sector which is going to help New Zealand to build back better. So, some quick highlights, and I'm actually going to throw in some lowlights too. Highlights are very short. It's been a great conference that we were fortunate to be able to hold in this COVID period. It's been a fantastic celebration of many things, including social impact infrastructure. That was a really good thing. And an overdue awakening this year to the mental health issues afflicting parts or perhaps all of our sector. That's it for highlights. Lowlights. This is a challenge, really, and it's built on many of the discussions I've had with you over the last 2 days. It's the elephant in the room that so many speakers have described on both days. As a country, we are afraid somehow of the commitment to action. As one of our colleagues said to me just a couple of hours ago, you could shut your eyes and imagine you were at this conference 5 years ago, hearing very similar things. The problems and the issues don't change. We heard speakers say that too. The problems and the issues may even have become worse in that 5-year period. Only the names and the sectors have been changed to protect both the innocent and the guilty. Right, so it's Groundhog Day on describing the problems. In fact, in New Zealand, we are becoming champions of describing and outlining the problems. But when it comes to action, we suck. As so eloquently put earlier today by Shamabil. So that's our challenge. That's the low light. As Leonie Freeman also and many others have said, we're actually sick of talking about it. I'm going to get really challenging now. We need more Kiwi builds. I can almost feel that groan of nah coming from the crowd. But I'll challenge that. We don't want every aspect of another Kiwi build, of course. And we have learned the lessons. They will be informing what comes next, of course. But the culture of taking bold risks, moving to action quickly, and failing sometimes is a concept that as a group we should actually embrace and admire. So there's my challenge to you. That concludes both my rant and the formal part of the conference for 2020, which means it's now time for the announcement of our much coveted awards, namely the Best Exhibition Booth Award, the Best Keynote Speaker Award, and for the first time, the Emerging Talent Best Essay Award, sponsored by Anthony Harper. I would now like to hand over to Sarah Lang, who is going to assist with our 3 awards next.
I'm a moonwalker. I'm like empty up in the clouds. I know it sounds awkward. You're filthy as shards, filthy as shards. You're a sweet talker.
Thank you very much, Andrew. For the last 3 years, Infrastructure New Zealand has presented the Best Exhibition Booth Award at Building Nations, with the winners Rawlinson's, Wellington City Council and EY respectively taking out the awards. This year, as voted by you through our new app polling system, I am delighted to announce the 3 finalists. Third place this year for the Best Exhibition Booth was EY. Second place this year was ANZ. And the winner for the 2020 Best Exhibition Booth goes to ICBC. A round of applause for ICBC. Do we have a representative from ICBC?
This is the bit where you dance to fill in time, Sarah.
Shweta, congratulations. A well-earned award for your team this year.
Thank you so much for voting us, and please come and, if you haven't had the tea, please come and join us. Thank you. My team, please can my team come up? My team, ICBC, come up?
No, we haven't got to.
No?
No.
Okay, thank you.
We just need to go down. Okay. Thanks very much. Congratulations, ICBC. I had hoped for a live panda, but I think they did pretty well with their bamboo display this year. Congratulations, well deserved. Our next award is a new one this year, and it is for the Best Keynote Speaker. The three finalists are: third place, Chris Money from EY. Second place, Hamish Glenn from Infrastructure New Zealand. And the winner for the inaugural Best Keynote Speaker Award at ReBuilding Nations 2020 was Richard Hobbs from Transpower. Congratulations, Richard.
Thank you very much for to Infrastructure New Zealand for putting on such a great event, and thanks everyone.
Thanks very much. Congratulations, Richard. And finally, we have the winner of the inaugural Emerging Talent Network Essay Competition, sponsored by Anthony Harper. The ET Essay Competition was a great new initiative that this year has increased the profile of ET and encouraged many new people to join the network. Many thanks to Anthony Harper for sponsoring the award, and we look forward to developing the competition further next year. I'd now like to invite Karen Kemp from Anthony Harper to present the award. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Sarah, and good afternoon, everybody. As Sarah said, I'm Karen Kemp, and I'm a partner in the construction team at Anthony Harper. At Anthony Harper, we believe there is a difference. That is a difference in how we think, a difference in our perspective, and a difference in how we deliver legal services. So it was a natural choice and a great pleasure for us to become the foundation sponsor of the Emerging Talent Network this year. Sponsoring a cocktail function earlier this week, we'll be hosting events and seminars over the year, and of course, to present the award for the inaugural Emerging Talent Essay Competition. The Emerging Talent Network is for participants across the sector up to the age of 35, and these are the young people who represent the much-needed resources, capacity, capability, and pipeline that we've heard so much about over the last 2 days. They are the future of our industry, and now more than ever, we need to encourage and hear their voices, which may be voices of innovation or disruption, but they are courageous voices as well. I think we need to understand and harness the difference that they bring to the equation if we're truly to make our industry future-proofed and succeed in the next decades, 50 years. The inaugural Emerging Talent Network Essay Award gave us the opportunity to hear some of those voices in more detail. And there were some excellent and wide-ranging topics and essays submitted. The topic was, what should New Zealand do to seize the crisis and build back better? As I said, many excellent entries and many interesting ideas, as you'd expect. But there was a standout winner who wrote about the resilience of digital infrastructure and the need in New Zealand for a centre for digital infrastructure and governance. That winner is Kate Slater from Russell McVeigh. Is Kate still here?
Talent Network for the opportunity to attend the conference. It's been a fantastic few days to hear from some amazing speakers and looking forward to being more involved in the future. Thank you.
And thank you, Karen. Right, a very quick wrap up with the thank yous. We trust you've all enjoyed the past 2 days of debate and conversation, and that you take away some new contacts and something of value that you can embed into either your strategy or some part of your organisation for what will inevitably a very challenging 2021. First, thank you to all 39 of our sponsors for supporting us again this year, especially our premier sponsor, ANZ. Thank you. She's hiding down the back, but I'd like to thank you, Miriama, in your way. I like that. We can't reach an elbow bump from here. You've done a stellar job as MC this year. I've really enjoyed your work and your summaries and the fresh approach you have brought to rebuilding nations this year. Thank you. I'd also very much like to give a genuine vote of thanks to you attendees. You know that we've set some records here, 866, that's the ego number we hit for attendees. But I've got to tell you, from this perspective, we have absolutely kicked the record out of the park for the number of people in the final session. Give yourselves a clap. Two more. Thank you to all our keynote speakers and panellists for sharing your knowledge and insights. If we can leverage the ideas and experience held within this room over the next coming months and years, I think we have a fantastic opportunity to build back better. Thank you. Finally, a big thank you to the Infrastructure New Zealand team that pulled this event off. I'd like to ask them to come to the stage, please. So that team of our staff members being Sarah, Hamish, Sally, Nicole, Leonard, Tara, Katerina and Natalie. You'll recognise them when you see them. Please come to the stage. Despite confronting so many challenges this year, this team has delivered yet another award-winning conference in my eyes. So please come on stage, and while they are coming here, I can fill. I'll note that we picked up the best corporate event. This is the team that did it for last year's conference. First of all, I'd like to thank COVID for eliminating the competition. I think we've got a very good chance of doing it again. While they're coming up, Sally was also mentioned as a finalist at those awards in the Experienced Event Manager category. She didn't win it, but she went up on stage with Sarah to pick up the big gong. And just reminding you all again that only a couple of years ago, Sarah was our New Zealand Women of Influence. It's very important. Now, here's the team. Thank you very much. I'd also like to mention, while they're here but not call them up, There's a couple more close people in this group that are here year in, year out. Not necessarily this first bloke, John Ray, but he did a very good job in the last couple of months of holding the gang together. So I know you're here somewhere, John. Thank you. Jess in comms, she deserves a gong. She's a real behind-the-scenes player every year. Liz from Cut the Mustard, she's floating around cutting the mustard somewhere. And also Doug, the photographer. You've been with us for years, mate. Thank you. Thanks to the team. We're on a time frame here. We're not going to let them all talk. Okay, that's about enough talking from me too. So I'd like to hand over for the last time to Miriama to close us out. Miriama, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Well, e te whānau, it has been my pleasure being your MC this year at Rebuilding Nations, which is, of course, Infrastructure New Zealand's biggest conference ever. We have discussed so much, traversed the infrastructure deficits, we've talked about decarbonising and flipping the transport fleet, and not so much how, but when. The housing crisis and how that informs so much of the growing inequity in this country, which ultimately serves no one. We've talked about climate, about how to serve the environment, and that its needs do not need to be sacrificed to the economic imperative. In fact, they are the same. Nature is infrastructure, said one of our speakers. But the big message of these 2 days was to stop talking. Don't write reports, just devise and do. So it's been a great and challenging 2 days, and I've really enjoyed it. I'd like to take the opportunity to once again thank our premier sponsor ANZ, our gala dinner sponsor BNZ, and our gold sponsors EY, Fletchers, Westpac and Becker. I know Andrew thanked our sponsors, but it does bear doing it again for such an enormous event. Our 39 sponsors, our 120 speakers, our 850 delegates and our 26 suppliers. Thank you for making Rebuilding Nations 2020 such a success, despite the challenges that everyone has faced this year. For them and for all of our speakers, please, a round of applause. And just a final note, we know it's been a hard year for everyone, but of course out of crisis comes opportunity for renewal, to imagine something different, to see the world with a new and sharper lens. This is the time to truly rebuild rebuild back better, and perhaps to reimagine that as to build forward better, which we heard earlier in the conference. And we are joined with you in the hope that that is exactly what happens. With our gratitude, ladies and gentlemen, we have a farewell cocktail for you, courtesy of Infrastructure New Zealand, for you to end the day with. Kia pai tō koutou pō. Have a great night. E te whānau, tēnei te mihi nunui ki a koutou. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā koutou katoa. Thank you.
Stop. Listen. Papa Tuanuku, the Earth Mother, is breathing. Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, still. Our maunga, our mountains, standing strong. Our moana, our ocean now louder than ever. Our tui and our keriru now need not fight with the daily hum of our busy lifestyles. Our people's waiata, normally loud and joyful, now soft and distant, waiting for the right time to rise again. Our land renewing, replenishing, ready for your return. And our kai, our food, preparing to nourish. Enjoy time with your whānau, your families, your loved ones, and soon we'll unite again. Noho tawhiti tū kotahi. Sit at a distance, stand as one. We, our land, our waters, our people, we aren't going anywhere. Dream, plan. And when the time is right, we welcome you. But for now, Listen. Papa Tuanuku is breathing.
Only one kind. Hush now, child.